Hello, I'm Caleb, part of the Narrate team. This week is part 3 of a 4-part series called We Need You to Lead. We Need You to Lead is a series that talks about the importance of how leadership is central to living life well. We all have some sort of power and influence in our life. The question is, what do you do with the power and influence that you do have? This week, Adam challenges us to leverage our power and influence towards other people.
This morning, I want to talk about a word that we have our 4-letter words that we never say, like from a stage or in the office or in a particular context that you know what I'm with, right? Like you don't need me to say them. Like the unspeakable 4-letter words, or for many of you, they're very speakable. But I want to talk about a word that I think ranks up there with those words. In fact, I think this word is probably something that you would find more awkward to use than any one of those words, particularly at work or in your home or when you're talking about your dreams or your ambitions for the future. It's a word that's funny because it captures something that all of us already possess, and yet we are maybe reluctant to even admit that we possess it. It feels kind of dirty to even say that we already possess this quality. It's something that all of us already have. Like we have some of us more than others, but all of us, by the nature of being alive and being human, and if you view your life through the lens of the text, then by the nature of being made in God's image, like you already have some of it. And yet what makes it tricky is you want more of it, but you would never admit that. Like you would dare not say that out loud. So it's something you have, it's something you want more of, but you would never want to admit that you want more of it. It's something that would be incredibly awkward to sit down at your conference table or in your office, or even to look at your spouse and say this word and to admit that you have this particular quality. And yet what makes it even more complicated or more interesting to me is that despite the fact that you have it, you tend to resent people who have more of it than you. Like that's kind of the way that it works. Like you feel okay wanting more of it, but if you ever get the sense that someone's agenda is to get more of it themselves, then you would be highly suspicious of them and their motives. This is the reason why we are incredibly suspicious of politicians, because part of the game is they're supposed to want this, but they're not supposed to admit that they want this. This is what kind of makes us, and many of us, hate authority, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. The word that I want to talk about this morning is power. And if you're part of the Narrate community or have been for over a year, this is something we've talked about in the past. And you might be thinking, like, why are we here again already? We're here kind of unplanned. I didn't necessarily anticipate this being one of the messages in this series. And yet the more that I processed and the more that I planned, and with other factors filtering into there, what occurred to me is we can't possibly talk about leadership from Jesus' perspective. Listen, I understand that not all of you are in on that. I understand that not all of you are like, I follow him. But I also think that the reason you're sitting here is you're at least intrigued by that. Either that or she's going to take you to lunch afterwards, and it'll just make for better conversation if you have some semblance of understanding here. If we're going to talk about leadership from Jesus' perspective, I think we have to talk about this word power. It's uncomfortable. It's awkward. But we have to talk about it, and here's simply why. Because you all have it. Like everyone in this room has some level of power. And yet the way that we culturally tend to deal with this issue is we just avoid it entirely. We just don't talk about it. We pretend like we don't want it. We pretend like we don't want more of it. We pretend like we're okay with it, but they should never have it. It's this weird game we play, and yet you have power. Listen, if you're like in 6th grade, you're sitting there thinking, I don't have any power. And all of us that aren't remember being there, like you're thinking like, oh, when I'm in 8th grade, when I'm in high school, when I have my driver's license, when I'm an upperclassman in high school, when I get out of my parents' house, then I'll have power, right? We've all been there. But listen, there's power structures in your world. You know as well as I do that if you wear a certain type of clothing, you have power, particularly if you wear the yellow jeans, right? Because that gives you the power. Like there's clothes that you can wear that other people can't, and by the nature of your wearing them, you have more power than them, but it doesn't stop there. There's athletics. If you can dribble a basketball or catch a football or eat more hamburgers and be better at the line than the next guy, you have power. Athletics gives us power. Sitting in a math class or any class, if you're among one of the elite in that class, that gives you power. And the tricky thing about student power and classroom power is the other way to get power is to be the one that has the least amount of knowledge and then just make fun of the teacher and everyone around, right? There's all kinds of ways to get power. Well, when you get into later middle school, and I'm sure it already happens, but into high school, there's a real easy way to get power. It has a lot to do with the drug and alcohol scene in high school. Because it's hard to get power, playing football? Because you have to practice. You have to lift weights. It can be hard to get power because of your clothes, because your parents just might not be able to afford them. But alcohol, like being the guy who can slam the most Schmidt or whatever it is today in this world, Keystone Light, I don't know. Am I indicting myself? That's power. Being the one with the connection and the goods, it's power. If you're a parent, like, I know you know this, but just if I could just kind of remind you how much power you have. Caleb and Sarah and Bridget and Kate and I were in some meetings a couple weeks ago, and a guy named Derry Long, who's on staff at Journey, who just finished up his PhD, was giving a presentation, and his PhD was on empowering systems. He wanted to know what makes for a business culture, a work culture, even a home culture, what makes it very empowering and what makes it disempowering. He did PhD-level research on this. One of the things he shared as he was talking a little bit about his findings was that over 50% of the people that he interviewed in a one-on-one interview, one of the things that they shared was that one of the repeating messages in their head that they left their home with was, "You'll never amount to anything." Like, I instantly kind of went into a cold sweat, right? Because I'm assuming that the message that those people are carrying isn't one that was actually said to them, or at least not over 50% of people. And so you kind of I found myself thinking like, oh man, when I say this or when I do this, and when I say things like, well, life's going to be miserable if you continue to act that way, like, is that the way that translates? Is I'm never going to amount to anything? Like, it's terrifying, isn't it? Teresa mentioned the other day that Lincoln was going to be 10, our oldest, in a couple months, and suddenly I felt old, and I went, oh my word, like half of his life in our house is over. If you're a parent, you have power. If you're a spouse, listen, this isn't like a chauvinist male thing or female thing. Let's just be honest, like both sides have power, incredible influence over the emotions and the finances and the future and the dreams and the ambitions of one another. And like as a parent now, you sit there and you kind of get hives when you think about handing over your little girl or your little boy to some like club-footed person that's not really going to respect them. And that's exactly what their parents went through. And now you're that person. Like, go talk to your in-laws, and you'll quickly find how much power you have as a spouse, as an American. Kind of case in point, right? It just occurred to me this week as kind of processing all this, that as an American, I have more power when it comes to the food I eat and the toilet that I flush and the amenities that we have than Julius Caesar. Isn't that weird to think? Like some of the richest people in world history, the privileges we have as Americans, they're so much greater than the ones they had. It's power. If you're a boss, a supervisor, an entrepreneur, an owner, in any sense have supervising powers, you could walk out of here right now and make a decision that'll cause ripples for years, maybe for generations. You determine what employees make. You determine what benefits they have and don't have. The words that you say determine the tone and the culture of their dinner when they get home from work that night. It's power. So here's simply my point. We don't like to talk about power because it feels slimy and gross. And I think our human tendency, probably for sure a general human tendency, but certainly our cultural tendency is to just avoid it. But here's the catch. If we're people who are really pursuing Christ, and whether you follow him or are intrigued in following him and are asking like, Lord, how do I honor you with my life? You can't really have that conversation without admitting that you have power and then beginning to wonder, so how do I use it? Like, if you're bored with the Bible right now or not sure where to start, here would be a challenge to you. Just pick a gospel, pick Mark, it's the shortest one, the most action, and just read it through the lens of what Jesus says to people who have and think they don't have power. You could read the entire gospel narratives, all 4 of them, just through this lens. And you see Jesus rebuking people for their misuse of their power. You see people challenging people because they think they don't have power, but they do. We see Jesus giving people more power because of the way they use it and taking some of that power away because of the way they use it. It's the entire Bible. It's power. But we just like to kind of run away from it. If you're in business, I love my conversations with my business owning friends. I'm not one, so for me, I'm just kind of that nerd that is intrigued, but I don't really understand the pressures or any of those different things. But here's what I pick up on almost every time. I just had a couple of these this week, and that is the rules and the regulations that you deal with as a business owner. They're insane. The forms, the things you sign. Some of you are like, I'm not the owner, but I work for the state. Yep, same idea, right? Like the forms, maybe in mortgage, there's all these different ways. Why does the government give us so many rules? And again, I'm not trying to be political here. Isn't it because they understand how dangerous power is? And one of the ways we like to use it is just to pretend like people can't have it. Here's what it looks like in my context, in the kind of church nonprofit context, is what looks really, really righteous is to say no single person in our organization has power. It's never me, it's we. So we move away from the leader with power and we move to the committees with power. And some of you have even been around organizations like this. I've worked for churches like this where it was like, which is none of them that you know of that I've ever referenced, so don't take that as criticism. But it's like, okay, someone says charge, and it's like, okay, it takes 6 months worth of committee meetings to determine whether or not we really can charge. Why? Because they're afraid of power. And the problem with that whole disposition to leadership is when we say follow we, not follow me, we's not any better with power than me is if we hasn't really thought about how to use power. It's tricky, complicated, and I'm sorry I'm clearing my throat, and if it sounds like my head is in a can, that makes two of us. So, this morning I just want to ask one question. The wording of this question I'm indebted to Andy Stanley for. I think it's probably more metaphorical in our context than not, but it's simply this. What do you do when it dawns on you that you're the most powerful person in the room? As a classroom teacher, as a manager, as a business owner, as a parent, as a spouse, what do you do when it dawns on you that all eyes are looking to you? Like a decision needs to be made, and you need to make it. Something needs to happen, and you're the one that gets to decide. There's been a long conversation, there's been a long dialogue, and now it's on you. What do you do when you recognize how much influence you have? You're standing with a group of friends, and the conversation about a certain someone or a certain idea goes in a certain direction, and suddenly you realize what you say about her or what you say about that idea will dramatically influence the direction of the group. What do you do when you recognize how much influence you have? See, this is the trick. We love the word influence. We hate the word power. They're the same thing. It's just that one is way less intrusive. Whether you avoid the topic or not, you have it. Now, one of the things before we jump into where we're going to go this morning, some of you, and I think a great many of you are current card-carrying members of this club, and I know I am on occasion. Some of you hate authority, like hate, capital H. You hate any kind of authority. Some of you probably have had a specific experience in with a specific kind of authority, and so because of the way your dad treated you, or because of how controlling your parents were, or because of the way that boss treated you, you just hate men, or you hate parents, or you hate bosses. Some of you have been in a church context, and you've seen power abused, and so you hate authority like the one I represent. And part of what happens to those of us who hate authority is the more established authority becomes, the more suspicious we become, and the more we resent it, because we all kind of like the guy who has a little flag, but we don't like the guy who has a big flag. Like some of you despise authority, even Christian authority, or any kind. And listen, before we jump into this, because I know this is going to be kind of abrasive to some of you, I just want you to know I understand. I've been there. Many of us have. I'm still there on occasion. And the reason I understand is because the reality is that if I had been parented the way you were parented, if I had been treated by a boss the way you'd been treated by a boss, if I had been a part of that church, if I had seen power abused the way you've seen power be abused, I would probably feel the same way you do. Like if I'd watched as people took advantage of privilege and opportunity that came with power and used it to their own end, I would probably be just as suspicious as you. But this morning I want to call a truce. Because here's the catch. As a person who has been taken advantage of by power, you are so well positioned to have power. And so before you hate the business that's bigger than you could have ever imagined being, can I just challenge you to just chill? Because you have no idea that God might call you to be the type of person that leads a business that big. Why? Because as someone who's seen the abuse of power at the level you've seen it abused, you make a great candidate for him to empower. And so my point is simply this, but before you just write off all authority, because I understand how easy that is to do, will you just stop and consider that maybe the misuse of authority you've seen makes you a prime candidate for God to give you authority? This is what happened to Moses. Moses watched authority be abused for 40 years, and then kind of as the consummate hippie, he just kind of went, I'm done. And he walked out of the established country and into the desert and lived with sheep. See, hipsters, it goes a long ways back. He just wandered around. He was done. And then 40 years into it, God said, hey, Moses, I've got something for you to do. It involves a lot of power, a lot of authority. And why was Moses such a great candidate for that? Because he watched it be abused. So before you write off the organizations or the teams or the churches or the individuals that are bigger than you, maybe you need to consider what God might want to do in you. You just have no idea. So the story that I want to look at this morning is found in John 13, and probably some of you will be quite familiar with it. This happens on Thursday before Good Friday. So in a little bit, we're going to take communion. That's kind of a celebration of the Last Supper. This is the supper before the Last Supper. It's on Thursday night. That's on Friday night. Everything goes down for Jesus shortly thereafter. But in this story, Jesus, he addresses the question, what do you do when you actually start dealing with the power that you have? What do you do when you decide to stop running from the idea of power and you actually start acknowledging that God has given us power? What do you do when it dawns upon you that suddenly you're at the top of the organization, suddenly you're the boss, suddenly you're the parent, suddenly everyone's looking to you? So let's just jump into John 13. It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and to go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world. Now, if you read the new NIV, the translation here, I think, misses it. The old translation has it better. Because, I'm a scholar and I know these things. It's because I read a commentary who went, hey, they missed it. But here's the way your old Bible says it. He now showed them the full extent of his love. So the context here is Jesus is about to show his guys the full extent of his love. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Now look at this next phrase. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his, what's the word there? It's power. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power. Now listen, I don't for a second claim to understand all the implications of this and all the ins and outs of what that looks like, because that's a little bit bigger than I can get my head around. But here's what we know. That at this moment, Jesus knew that all power, that all authority, that whatever that looks like, whether it's in a receptacle, I don't know, but that all of it, not of the church, not of the organization, not of the business, not of the family, in the entire world, all of it was available to him. It was all his. Like suddenly Jesus realized he had more money, so to speak, more opportunity, better technology, that he was in the prime position to have and do anything he wanted. And the next word is so important to the whole. He says, so he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. See, Jesus was at this moment when he recognized everyone in the room is looking at me. All power is mine. I can do anything I want here. And the first thing he did was he shed his symbol of authority. He got rid of his symbol of authority. And of course, the disciples had to be thinking, like, what are you doing? Jesus, what in the world are you doing? In fact, I think in their heart, as they were asking this question, had Jesus dealt with the question that they were asking in their head, I really think as we work our way through this passage, that what Jesus would have said to them was, hey guys, I'm going to show you what to do when you have power. Guys, I'm going to show you what to do when it dawns upon you that you have influence. I'm going to show you what to do when you realize that suddenly you're not the 22-year-old newbie in the business anymore. Sorry, 22-year-old newbies. But suddenly you're like the 32-year-old veteran. Suddenly I'm going to show you what to do when you realize that you're now the established. You're the control. You're the spouse. You're the parent. He goes on. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He does the unspeakable. He gets up from the position of power, and he takes on the position of the first primary servant. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Now, Peter here is speaking for the rest of them. Implication, you're not washing my feet. Implication, Jesus, it wasn't that long ago that I watched those very same hands raise a guy from the dead. Jesus, it wasn't very long ago where I watched you take those hands and restore sight to somebody who was born blind. Jesus, you have crawled off the pedestal. Get back on the pedestal. We need you on the pedestal. Jesus replied, you do not realize now what I am doing, but later you'll understand. I don't think Peter would have been offended by that because almost nothing that he said did they understand first take. I think he'd just been like, oh yeah, that makes sense. When he'd finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. So you see the full cycle here. He had all authority. Like he could fulfill his bucket list. Not to mention, like this in just a few hours, he's going to get arrested. Just a few hours after that, he's going to get beaten to a pulp. Just a few hours, just 24 hours from now, he's a dead man. All power. Can you just feel that? He can do anything he wants. He knows his time is limited. He gets his last stake at doing whatever he wants to do. And he sheds his symbol of authority. And he washes his guy's feet. Do you understand what I've done for you? To which the sarcastic one in the crowd would have went, well, no, you just told us we wouldn't understand it for a long time, so no, we don't understand. Which means that your sarcasm is anointed. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I've set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. See, guys, the day is going to come when suddenly you're the one with power. Suddenly you're the one with influence. Suddenly you're the one with the established business. Suddenly you're the one who's the classroom teacher. Suddenly you're the spouse. You're the parent. The day is going to come where suddenly you have more money in the bank than you could ever imagine having. Suddenly the day is going to come where you recognize you have power. Guys, don't forget this day, he says. Very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Implication. Guys, remember, because when you have power, you're going to be tempted to use it for yourself. But remember, your Savior, your Lord, the most brilliant person to ever live, God of the universe, when he had power, when he came to the realization that he was the most powerful person in the room, he leveraged it for the other people in the room. It wasn't about privilege. It wasn't about opportunity. It was about using his authority to serve those who are with him. Guys, remember, because someday you'll be them. You'll be the 10-year veteran in the business. You'll be the owner. You'll be the one, with the authority. He continues, now that you know these things, you'll be blessed if you do them. See, what we know from history is that the disciples, just a little bit from now, they were rock stars. They were among the most powerful people in that part of the world. And the reason why we admire them, and the reason we have cathedrals built after their name, and the reason why we call them saints is because they did the very thing Jesus said. See, here's one of the ways to look at this. Did you know I'm working my way through a book called Switch right now? Anybody read that? It's about change. It's a really, really challenging, good book. Reading it for obvious reasons with some of the stuff we're dealing with. And in there she talks about there's a couple ways, really a few ways that we can motivate people. One is through the threat of punishment, which I'm really good at as a parent, all too often. So I got some frogs. Someone gifted me some little frogs that just swim around in water and they never leave. The staff got me these. And so the boys last night were asking, like, hey, so Dad, could you bring the frogs home? Sure, we can bring the frogs home. Or maybe you can just buy your own frogs. Teresa looks at me and said, it's a gateway pet. You cannot do that. Power. So there's ways that we can motivate people. We can motivate them by punishing them, the threat of punishment. We can motivate people via the threat or the promise of reward. But what they talk about is that what the data says is one of the most successful ways to motivate people is through identity. To ask them questions, and that's actually what was on this slip, to appeal to them on the basis of who do they want to be. And here's the 3 questions they give. We ask questions in these moments like this. Who am I? Who am I? What kind of situation is this? And what would someone like who I want to be do in this situation? See, that's what Jesus is doing here. He's the God of the universe, for crying out loud. He could make us do whatever he wants. But in this moment, he appeals to them, he appeals to us and says, hey, listen, someday you're going to have all the power. And in that moment, let's just be clear, what you're deciding is, do you want to be like me? Because we understand the benefits. The reason we admire Jesus is because we understand how much of a servant he was. He's saying, listen, what kind of leader? What kind of person with power do you want to be? I think one of the greatest examples of this is George Washington. Remember when you studied all this in elementary school? One author who I heard of, he was writing about this situation, and he's talking about King George, who became aware of George Washington. Because remember, the story was George Washington was this great Revolutionary War hero, and so then they made him president, and then they made him president again, and then the whole country was poised to make him emperor, to make him ruler, to make him king. And King George III said, well, let me just get there. This author says this about him. He says, first, it's crucial to recognize that Washington's extraordinary reputation rests less upon his prudent exercise of power than on his dramatic flair at surrendering it. Upon learning that Washington intended to reject the mantle of emperor, King George III allegedly observed. Now remember, King George, the King of England, he's not king because of anything other than who his daddy was. And the whole system, the whole reason this whole America thing happened was they were using their power for themselves. King George III, upon hearing that Washington was going to reject the mantle of emperor, says this. Go ahead. If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. And Washington did just that. And in doing, demonstrated that power is not evil, but it does best when it lands in the hands of people who are willing to use it for others. In doing that, Washington demonstrated that he is a great candidate for power because he was willing to give it up. Listen, you can continue to avoid the conversation all the time. You can pretend that you're not one of the veterans in the office. You can pretend like you don't suddenly have a bigger income than you ever thought you'd have. You can pretend like you're not incredibly well networked, that you're not incredibly talented at sports or math or whatever, that you don't have the right clothes. You can continue to pretend that your peers don't look at you. And in doing, you'll be doing what everyone else does. And Jesus shows up on the scene then and now, not that I'm Jesus, but his words are here, and says, hey, listen, there's another option. You can leverage it. You can use your power for the other people in the room. You can be the type of leader, the type of boss, the type of parent, the type of spouse who serves. Listen, it's not lost upon me that this is so foundational and maybe even snooze fest because of that. But we jumped into this series and said, hey, we're all leaders. We all have influence. We all have people who pay attention to what we say. We all need to understand leadership. But what strikes me is we can study leadership like crazy. We can listen to podcasts and read books, and trust me, I love doing that as much as any one of you. And in doing, we can gain a better understanding of influence, a better understanding of how to get more, how to be more respected. But what strikes me is that in doing so, that doesn't necessarily guarantee that we become better leaders. Because leadership is about service far more than it is about getting people to do the things you want them to do. And so I appeal to you in that day, however far or recent, where you made a decision to follow Jesus and you went, man, I can't think of a better candidate to shape my life after. I can't think of a better person to believe in. Yes, I believe in the cross. I believe in the blood. I believe in the resurrection. I appeal to you on that basis to not avoid the issue of power, but to think long and hard about how do you use it. And for those of you that are wrestling with Jesus, I just can't think of a more basic, important, integral conversation. Integral, as I've been told. It's about Jesus, who had all power and all authority, who claims to have set it aside and went to the cross to make things right between us and God, and then said, now let me live my life through you.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.